Welcome to The Source, where we combine the headlines with in-depth conversations with the newsmakers themselves. Sitting in for Pinky Webb, I'm Ria Tanwat Cotrillo. Today on the program, the Philippines successfully completes another resupply mission to Ayungin Shoal despite continued harassment by China. Beijing defends its actions, claiming Manila illegally transported construction materials to BRP Sierra Madre. And senators vowed to increase the intelligence funds of the Coast Guard and Navy amid increasing tensions with China in the West Philippine Sea. Philippine Coast Guard spokesperson for the West Philippine Sea, Commodore Tarriela, and International Studies Professor Renato de Castro join us live in the program. Tensions in the West Philippine Sea escalated anew with another close call over the weekend. Chinese ships sailed dangerously close and eventually blocked Philippine Coast Guard vessels escorting boats on a routine supply mission to Ayungin Shoal. CNN Philippines, along with a number of journalists, was there to witness it all. Our senior correspondent David Santos has the story.
At the break of dawn, Chinese ships seen lurking, then proceeded to shadow the flotilla of Filipino vessels. They start tailing the Philippine Coast Guard ships, escorting wooden supply boats chartered by the Navy. Moments later, the dangerous maneuvers begin, and CNN Philippines was among a group of journalists who were there to witness how it all unfolded. Chinese Coast Guard ships sailing dangerously close to BRP Cabra, so close that at one point it almost rammed the PCG vessel. But BRP Cabra eventually outmaneuvers the Chinese ships to continue providing cover for Uniza May 2, one of the Filipino supply boats. A seemingly endless exchange of radio messages ensues.
I urge you to leave this area immediately. Any consequences in terms of that will be brought by you.
What we do in our own backyard is not of their concern. So why coordinate with them in the first place?
There were sightings of foreign aircraft flying overhead, including a U.S. Navy spy plane and also at least 2 Chinese Navy warships in the horizon. China Coast Guard then shifts its attention to the other Filipino Coast Guard vessel. Despite forcibly pulling a stop and now remaining stationary, BRP Sindangan is still being blocked by at least 2 Chinese vessels. This standoff at high seas now lasting for almost an hour. Earlier, the Chinese ship also trailed BRP Sindangan and the supply boat it is escorting, Uniza May 1, and tried to break them up. This video clearly shows how CCG 21556 sped off and crossed the bow of BRP Sindangan, a close call that forced the Filipino vessel to slow down just to avoid colliding with the Chinese ship. After hours of what seemed a cat-and-mouse chase at sea, the Chinese ships boxed in the 2 Filipino escort vessels. But the Filipino supply boats eventually made their way to Ayungin Shoal to deliver food and other supplies to troops stationed at the BRP Sierra Madre.
Are we going to be thankful that they didn't choose water cannon? Are we going to classify that they are de-escalating now? I don't think so. Whatever they have been doing in the West Philippine Sea since then and now remains to be illegal.
Aside from its much bigger Coast Guard ships, China is also tapping its maritime militia, seen now as becoming more aggressive to help set up blockades. Face-off between a David and a Goliath. That's how these recurring Manila-Beijing sea encounters are often described. The Philippines vowing never to back down despite having to stand its ground against a global superpower.
It ignites our patriotism and our dedication to serving the government.
For Filipino forces, the fight continues, hoping that one day these recurring tensions will eventually simmer down before it gets out of hand. On board BRP Sindangan in the West Philippine Sea, David Santos, CNN Philippines.
Beijing defended its dangerous maneuvers in the West Philippine Sea, claiming Manila illegally transported construction materials to the BRP Sierra Madre. China added that it has, quote, indisputable sovereignty over Ayungin Shoal. The 2016 arbitral ruling invalidated China's sweeping claims in the South China Sea, but Beijing has rejected the decision, calling it illegal, null, and void. Now let's go straight to the source of the story, International Studies Professor Renato de Castro. Sir, welcome to the show. Good morning. Thank you for being here.
Good morning. How are you doing?
All right, we have many questions to ask you, Professor Rene. Starting off with, what are your thoughts on the recent resupply mission to Ayungin Shoal? The good news is they were able to complete the mission. The not so good news is it came with a lot of aggression from China, who tried to block the Philippine vessels. Tell us what your assessment is of all this.
This will be a long game. Your reporter is kind of optimistic, thinking that it will simmer down. No, this will continue. China's goal is, to drive away the Ayungin Shoal, remove it, and eventually force us to remove our forces in the whole of the, Pag-asa Island, in the Spratlys. That is basically China's goal, to have control, absolute control over 85% of the South China Sea. So this will be a long game. And it's simply a matter of time when the Chinese would later escalate the game. I was in the National Security Advisor in the Council in 2015 when this first began. And slowly and surely, the Chinese are, of course, escalating the game. Just look at, for example, the ship they use, the Coast Guard vessel they use, it has a gun turret. It's used formerly a PLA, a People's Liberation Army's Navy, that the Coast Guard simply painted white. And you also see on the background the Chinese gray ships. So it's simply a matter of time when the Chinese will take the escalation initiative. Into what form, I simply don't know.
Right. So when you say escalation, we've already seen the use of water cannons. Are you saying that they might possibly use those gun turrets that are on their boats?
Threatening us. Yes, threatening us. Like it happened, I think, last year or 2 years ago when they removed the cover of the gun turret, of the 76-millimeter gun turret, and basically impress us that sooner or later they might fire the shot. They're also testing not only our resolve, they're also testing how the United States, our treaty ally, might react to this. Because, as you know, the statement of the United States has also become bolder in terms of there's no need to invoke the Mutual Defense Treaty. Any attack on Philippine public vessel, the Philippine Coast Guard and the Armed Forces of the Philippines would trigger the Mutual Defense Treaty. So the Chinese are playing a game of chicken, not only against the Philippines, but also against the United States.
For now, Professor Rene, would you say that the actions of China, especially over the past few days, could we categorize this simply as being part of China's gray zone tactics? And how long do we expect to stay for all of this to just stay in the gray zone?
Well, whether that's gray zone or not is another matter, because they're already blocking a Philippine public vessel. So I think people still do not want to use this term, but an American analyst, Mr. Powell, Raymond Powell, used another term to signify that it's not simply an aggressive action. He used a word that, people, especially in the government and even analysts like me, would not want to use. And because it has a really, a very negative implication, the term blockade. Blocking our resupply vessel to a Philippine warship. And if you look at the dictionary, if you're a legal expert, blockade is actually tantamount to an act of war. So it's not anymore, whether it's a gray zone or not, I tend to disagree. They're basically blocking us. It's it's clear and present a case of a blockade.
All right, earlier you mentioned, sir, the United States, of course, a player here. Our reporter, David Santos, mentioned that, a U.S. plane was seen flying over the area while all of this was happening. What are the effects of that on this conflict?
Well, it's also, according to Secretary Chudoro, they happen to be there conducting freedom of overflight, freedom of overflight, not simply navigation. So it's there. Whether there's coordination or not, again, this is also the United States testing, showing to China that we don't recognize your expansive claim in the South China Sea by sending a P-8 Poseidon. Washington or Indo-PACOM might even consider possibly, without coordinating with the Armed Forces of the Philippines or the Philippine government, maybe an Arleigh Burke destroyer. Just happened, and the Pentagon or the Indo-PACOM might simply say, oh, it's just happened to be there.
Right.
So my point here is, sooner or later in this game of chicken between China, the Philippines, and the United States, someone would take the escalatory initiative.
All right. Of course, all sides have said that they don't want war. That being the case, what is China's actual end goal with all of these activities?
To drive away, to remove the Ayungin Shoal and basically cause demoralization in the Philippine Coast Guard, to the armed forces of the Philippines, and to the Philippine nation, impressing upon us, you cannot challenge an emerging regional power like China. You simply have to accept what is given, the fact that we are more powerful than you.
Right. Well, speaking of...
again, we cannot help but admire the officer and men of the Philippine Coast Guard, the Armed Forces of the Philippines, and of course, for entire Philippine government for standing up for what we believe is our maritime entitlement. So at the end of the day, it is a test of will. If we really have to show to the Chinese that you could not simply prevent us from resupplying Ayungin Shoal, but of course, sooner or later, you will have somebody taking the escalatory initiative.
All right, last question, Professor Rene. China has also released a new standard map of the South China Sea. It doesn't just show a 9-dash line anymore, but now a 10-dash line. Do you think that this will have an impact on its behavior in the West Philippine Sea?
Definitely. It's showing to us China's ambition and China's determination to push through with expansive maritime claim that does not only include now the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea, also including the whole of Taiwan, and the waters also east of Taiwan, east of the Luzon Strait.
All right,
so
sir.
Expect more aggressive and expansive action from China.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us here this morning on The Source. That was International Studies Professor Renato de Castro. And we will be taking a short break. This is The Source on CNN Philippines. Please stay tuned. You're watching The Source on CNN Philippines. I'm Ria Tanwat Cotrillo. Our source today, PCG spokesperson for the West Philippine Sea, Commodore J. Tarriela. Sir, good morning. Thank you so much for being here.
Good morning, Ms. Ria. It's my pleasure to be here, and also good morning to your viewers.
All right, sir. Now, there was another resupply mission to Ayungin Shoal that was completed last week, but not without interference from China. Is this something we're just going to have to expect every time there's a resupply mission?
Well, that has always been our expectation, but for the Philippine Coast Guard and the Armed Forces of the Philippines, we're still going to carry out this resupply mission, no matter how many times that they're going to block our vessels, and no matter how they recalibrate their approach. We'll also be consistently performing this resupply operations, even with so many dangerous maneuvers that they can ever throw at us.
No, sir, to give us a better idea of exactly what happened, how many vessels from China tried to stop the mission?
For this particular resupply mission, the Chinese Coast Guard deployed 4 Coast Guard vessels. And right now, I think what is very unique in this operation, the recently completed resupply operation, is that among the 4 China Coast Guard vessels, there was only 1 China Coast Guard vessel that is somewhere between 110 to 115 meters long. Before, the deployment of the China Coast Guard vessels have always been very, they always have this huge sizes of vessels. But for this time, they deployed 3 smaller vessels, and there's only 1 big vessel that did the blocking. And then for the Chinese Maritime Militia,
Go ahead, sir.
hello?
Yes, go ahead, sir. We can hear you. All right, so we're going to try to fix that connection there with Commodore J. Tarriela of the Philippine Coast Guard. But before he got cut off, he was telling us that there were at least 4 Chinese Coast Guard vessels that tried to stop the resupply missions to Ayungin Shoal. He noted that only one vessel was of about 110 meters, which is the usual size they would deploy in that area. But he noted during this incident, the other 3 Chinese Coast Guard vessels were actually smaller. So he said that's probably the noted difference between, past incidents like this. He also shared with us that it always has been their expectation that resupply missions to Ayungin Shoal will be met with some resistance by the Chinese Coast Guard and other Chinese militia vessels. And that is something that happened. So we will be taking another short break right now. This is The Source on CNN Philippines. Please stay tuned. You're watching The Source on CNN Philippines. I'm Ria Tanwatco Trillo. Our source today, PCG spokesperson for the West Philippine Sea, Commodore J. Tarriela. Okay, so I want to go back to what we were talking about earlier regarding how many Chinese vessels were involved in trying to stop the resupply mission. You already mentioned that there were 4 Chinese Coast Guard ships. What about the militia vessels?
Yes, for this particular operation, it has been obvious right now that the Chinese Maritime Militia are taking orders from the China Coast Guard. And before, in the previous missions, the Chinese Maritime Militia are just performing covert, support in supporting the China Coast Guard in blocking the Coast Guard vessel. But this time, it has been very evident now that the Chinese Maritime Militia are now carrying out dangerous maneuver as well, and basically using their vessel to block the Philippine Coast Guard to proceed to Ayungin.
Okay, so they're taking a more aggressive stance as well. Commodore, let's show a picture that you shared on Twitter. If we can bring that to the screen right now. Maybe you can tell us exactly what happened here. Talk us through this photo.
Yeah, this particular photo was taken around 10 a.m., a few hours after we sailed from Sabina. And this is the time that the Philippine Coast Guard vessels were completely corralled. We were no longer able to maneuver to escort the resupply boats. But the good thing is, despite of all this Chinese Maritime Militia and Philippine Coast Guard vessel, China Coast Guard vessel completely hindering the maneuverability of the vessel, the resupply boats was able to reach Ayungin. So you can see BRP Cabra. There are 3 Chinese Maritime Militia right in front of it, totally blocking its forward. And from behind, you also have the China Coast Guard vessel there, also restricting its ability to maneuver. And then on the other side, the BRP Sindangan was also successfully blocked by the China Coast Guard vessels, 2 China Coast Guard vessels, and 1 Chinese Maritime Militia from behind. So this is actually their intention, to totally prevent the Philippine Coast Guard vessels from advancing and to separate it from the resupply boats of the armed forces of the Philippines.
So how was the supply boat actually able to get to Ayungin eventually?
Because from all the resources that they threw at us, the resupply boat was able to escape from this Chinese Maritime Militia and China Coast Guard vessels.
All right, so parang kung sa basketball yan, Commodore, they were doing like a group defense on 1 or 2 players, tapos nakalibre yung isa, parang ganon.
Yes, all of the forces that were deployed by China focus on us. That's why for the supply boats to proceed to the entrance of Ayungin Shoal.
Okay, that is very interesting. Now, when these types of encounters happen, how long do they usually last?
For this operation, it took us 3 hours from 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. as we tried to move forward from Sabina going to Ayungin Shoal. So there are a lot of dangerous maneuvers, and before they they would have this kind of formation to successfully block the Philippine Coast Guard vessels, it would take hours. But it made us very more difficult for us this time compared in the last resupply mission. Because as I said a while ago before my signal was lost, they were deploying big Coast Guard vessels before. And this is the only time that they deployed smaller vessels. And these smaller vessels have more ability to maneuver, and they're more faster now. That's why it's very easy for them to prevent us from advancing. Before, since these are larger vessels, it took them some time before they can turn their vessel, and they can also apprehend the vessel and prevent us from going forward.
All right, now that we understand better the role of the Chinese militia vessels, and as you said that they're becoming more aggressive, paano sila pwede tapatan ng PCG or ng Philippine government?
Well, the gray area of the Chinese maritime militia, Ms. Rhea, has long been contested, not just here in the Philippines, but in other ASEAN countries. We still have difficulty. How are we going to categorize them? For the U.S. government, they were categorized as People Action Force Maritime Militia, or the Chinese Maritime Militia. The Chinese embassy has always been mentioning that they don't have Chinese Maritime Militia, but these are just ordinary Chinese fishing vessels. So the other question is, if ever we're going to treat them as an ordinary fishing vessels, for example, in a particular area that they are swarming, and let's say that they have like 20 Chinese maritime militia in one maritime feature. The question is, can the Coast Guard carry out fishery law enforcement to drive them away in a particular area? And these Chinese maritime militia are even larger than the Philippine Coast Guard vessel. So these are the things that we need to think about. But the only approach now that we do every time we drive away this Chinese maritime militia is that we document them, we submit it to the National Task Force West Philippine Sea, and for the Department of Foreign Affairs to carry out the diplomatic action.
All right. Now, was the United States also present during the resupply mission? We understand that there was at least a U.S. plane flying overhead while this was happening.
Well, as what was reported by some of our media friends who were embedded at the Coast Guard vessels, they were able to see a Poseidon plane of the United States Navy. On the part of the Philippine Coast Guard, we are not aware. We never did the coordination with the U.S. government to carry out this overflight as the resupply operation is ongoing.
Okay, so officially walang coordination between Manila and Washington when this happened?
For the Philippine Coast Guard.
Yes,
I'm
yes.
not sure with any other government agency who reach out to the U.S. Embassy.
Right. Now, regarding future plans, Commodore, is the Philippine government planning to conduct another resupply mission soon?
Well, the continuance of the resupply operation is really imperative. You have to note the fact that we have troops stationed in BRP Sierra Madre, and it is an open book that there is really a need for us to make a lot of efforts to make sure that we're going to maintain our presence there. So it is going to be continued. We are still expecting to carry out this supply operation the next coming weeks or even months. But definitely, it's not the Chinese Coast Guard who can tell us not to carry out this mission anymore. It's also worth mentioning that the Chinese Coast Guard doesn't have any jurisdiction or authority to carry out law enforcement activity in the West Philippine Sea.
Now, Senate President Mig Zubiri, he's pushing for an increase in the confidential and intelligence funds of the Philippine Coast Guard and the Philippine Navy. How big of a boost is this, or will this be in your efforts in the West Philippine Sea?
Well, the increase of the intelligence fund for the Philippine Coast Guard is really a very big development for us to sustain our effort in the West Philippine Sea. Considering that we, as I have been mentioning for a lot of my interviews, the Philippine Coast Guard since 2009 only has 10 million intelligence fund. Now, how are we going to make use of this intelligence fund? There are a lot of acquisition that can be carried out with a very big amount of intelligence fund that doesn't have to pass through the regular procurement process. So I think with that amount of money that the Senate and the Congress will give to the Philippine Coast Guard, It will boost our capability to maintain our presence and to strengthen our MDA capability in the West Philippine Sea.
All right, sir. Thank you so much for speaking with us this morning. That was PCG spokesperson for the West Philippine Sea, Commodore J. Tarriela. And thank you for joining us here on The Source. Sitting in for Pinky Webb, I'm Ria Tanwat Cotrillo. You're watching CNN Philippines.